Hey there, advanced procrastinators. Welcome to another review session. We're looking at Chapter 9, Reconstruction today. Make sure you've already answered the study guide number 9 questions. That's what we'll be reviewing today. And as we're going through the video, please make sure that you are answering the YouTube video, checking for understanding questions that are in green. Today, there are quite a bit, but this is a very important subject, Reconstruction. And we're looking at after the Civil War. And given that the Civil War has ended, the South is destroyed and African Americans are now free. We're going to be looking at the federal government's steps to make sure that African Americans are incorporated into American society while contrasting that with steps made by racist politicians and citizen groups that prevented African Americans from having actual equal rights protection until the 1960s. So, one attempt to try to bring some kind of equality for African Americans, because now that they're free, they are called freedmen, right, is from the Abandoned Lands Act. Now, it established the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, this is the first federal institution ever that was essentially a welfare agency in the sense that the government is giving aid to a group. It's not protecting rights, it's actually helping people out. And this succeeded in building schools and trying to educate blacks. It was against the law to teach a slave to read and write, and education was seen as one of the primary ways that African Americans tried to achieve equality. Now, part of this was the idea of 40 acres and a mule, which was meant to confiscate land from slave owners and give the farmland to freedmen. I mean, now that the freedmen are free, that's great, but they have actually absolutely no possessions. And the idea of John Locke is life, liberty, and property. And as long as you have property, you have wealth. So the idea was to take the land from slave owners and give it to African Americans. Now, this was undermined when President Johnson pardoned the planters, which we'll get into later, who are ex-slave owners with over 20 slaves, and give them back their land. Okay. Now, Lincoln felt in his plan that the planters, not poor Southern farmers, were the ones that caused the Civil War. Because remember this, the majority of slaves were actually owned by the planters, not by actual ordinary Americans, right? And they had the most to lose if slavery was abolished. Now, predict, how could things have been different if freemen had received the planter-owned land? And the answer is, for a lot of African Americans, the opportunity would have been astronomical. The same opportunities that ordinary American settlers had in having access to land in the West through generations was an opportunity for all those groups to move up in society. And by not offering African Americans an opportunity to access to land, it basically ensured multi-generational poverty for the African Americans as a group of people. Now, federal government is going to expand its role after the Civil War during Reconstruction. You'll see it actually go back to laissez-faire during the Gilded Age, but during Reconstruction, number one, the federal government is going to take responsibility for protecting the rights of blacks. Yes, the federal government, white men in government, are going to try to help out black people in 1865 to 1877. Also, the government's going to take responsibility for rebuilding the South using money and the army. Those images you see above are images of the South after the Civil War. That is not Germany after World War II. That is the South after the Civil War. Now, remember this, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued during the Civil War, right? And what it did is it freed slaves in areas of rebellion. But it did not live up to its purpose after the Civil War ended, because the problem was this, right? Whites did not give blacks the same rights as whites once they were free. And that's going to be a theme that we'll be looking at the whole time here. Is yes, blacks are free, but they do not have equality. Right. Now, remember this, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. What is a constitutional amendment you need to memorize that ended slavery? And it is the 13th Amendment. That's the amendment that ended slavery. Okay. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in areas of rebellion, but did not free a single slave. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. Now, the Republicans were the political party that was founded and dedicated to ending slavery. And now that slavery is over, they are the ones that are going to be trying to bring African Americans equality in America. And one of their two of their goals is, one is to prevent Confederate leaders from gaining political power again. Right, the people that started the Civil War, Republicans saying you are not allowed to get back into the government again because you would impede our goals of economic equality and freedom for blacks. And the second one is actually containment for blacks. Yes, Republicans want to bring blacks equal rights, but they want them to live in the South. They want equal rights for them themselves. One, Blacks would serve as a voting bloc for Republicans in the South. And number two, if blacks moved to the North, they could possibly take white jobs and it would cause racial discomfort along the line of the Irish when they came to America. The Republicans in the North want to keep blacks in the South so they don't compete for jobs with whites. Now, Lincoln is the beginning of the Reconstruction policy, right? And his plan for Reconstruction was very, very lenient for the South. Even though he was the president during the Civil War and the South probably hated Lincoln more than any other person, he's the one person in America who did not want to punish the South. His plan for Reconstruction was a 10% loyalty oath. If 10% of the voters in the South pledged loyalty to America, your state's welcome back. And that's 1 out of 10 people to say, I love America. Now, his other thing was the idea that the South had to accept the idea that the United States was one nation and secession wasn't possible. That's the contract theory. So that seems easy enough, right? Say you love America and no, you guys can never leave again. We're a family, so just we're in it together. Lincoln did not want to punish the South. That's a key thing. A lot of people wanted to punish the South for the Civil War. Lincoln did not. Now think, why did Lincoln not want to punish the Civil War after the South? He was the president during the Civil War and saw firsthand the kind of destruction and devastation wrought by the Civil War because the South caused the Civil War in wanting to protect slaves. And the reason why is he was afraid, and he knew he was right, that whites would take their anger out on newly freed blacks, right? And whites would refuse to follow the federal government, right? Which would create a new problem, which would lead to a new civil war. Now, could Lincoln have gained support for this plan from Northerners? Like, hey, Northerners might want to punish the South too because hey, my son or my husband or my brother might have been killed in the Civil War, and I'm mad at the South. Let's get back at them. The answer is, could he have gained support from the North? Was yes. Lincoln was reelected president of the United States, right? And he had the support of Americans. He was the person that guided America through the Civil War. So people trusted Lincoln's leadership. I mean, there's a reason why he's arguably the greatest president in American history. Not even arguably, people say he is the greatest president in American history, right? And he had the support of the American people. People trusted him. Of course, what major problem is going to happen that's going to prevent his plan from being implemented of not punishing the South? And the answer is he is assassinated, right? And when he's assassinated, that leadership and that trust now goes in the hands of a new president, Vice President Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat, not a Republican, from Tennessee, a slave owning state. So we are going to replace Lincoln, the greatest president in American history, with Andrew Johnson, arguably the worst American president in American history, as well as arguably the most racist president in American history at a time when the responsibility of the government is to bring equal rights to African Americans. So Johnson's plan was similar to Lincoln's plan. It was also a 10% plan because he's from the South and he doesn't want to punish his fellow Southerners. But his loophole was, as we said earlier, he pardoned all planters, all ex-slaveholders. So they got to keep their land and they got to run for political position again. So if you think about it, evaluate, did the South really lose the Civil War? And at this moment, when President Johnson takes over after Lincoln, you could say no. I mean, slaveholders, right, who started the Civil War, found themselves back in power in the South. It's as if nothing happened, except they did lose their slaves. But here's the thing, right? They're not going to do anything to help freedmen vote or give them access to rights. And you say, well, yes, but they lost their slaves. Not really. They then passed something called the Black Codes, right? And these Black Codes were essentially meant to return freedmen, African Americans, back to slavery. And here is a series of laws under the Black Codes. One, freedmen needed a work license in order to get work. Well, you had to pay to get a work license. If you don't have any money, you can't get a work license. You could not own property at the same time. You had to rent property from a white person. So you could not go out and get your own property. So the same life, liberty, property, nope, not access. And you could be arrested for being vagrant or being homeless. So the idea here is you're not allowed to own property. And if you're on the street after night, you can be arrested. Now, how are these laws unfair? And does anybody in America care about freedmen? Now, the way these laws are unfair is, yes, they don't make sense. They are naturally unfair. You can be arrested for breathing. It's against the law to be black in the South and on your own. Okay. Does anyone care about these freedmen in the United States? Yes. They are called radical Republicans. Know these people. They are congressmen that want to punish the South and they want to provide equal rights for freedmen. So let's talk about these radical Republicans and what these congressmen are going to do after Lincoln is assassinated, even before he's assassinated president. Now, their plan for Reconstruction was a lot harsher than Lincoln's plan. It was called the Wade-Davis Bill. Okay, and in this Wade-Davis Bill, they said they did not want high-ranking leaders of the Confederacy to hold public office, which is exactly what President Johnson allowed these ex-Confederates to do. Also, instead of 10% of Southerners saying, I love the country, the radicals had the 50% plan, which is half the voting population to pledge loyalty. Now, Lincoln pocket vetoed, meaning he didn't veto it, but he didn't vote on it either, which means it disappeared. He pocket vetoed the Wade-Davis bill because he knew that, one, the South would never get 50% of people and the states would never enter, and it would lead to his fear of another civil war. Then Lincoln is shot, and less capable President Johnson is put in office, who pardons the high-ranking Confederates, which infuriates radical Republicans. Right. Here's another bill passed from the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Right. And this is right after Lincoln is shot in 1865. And basically, it says that blacks are citizens of the United States with all rights for voting. It also said restricting a person's rights is illegal. Right. And it changes the role of the federal government, right, to also enforce civil rights for African Americans. Now, think about this. This is passed by the radical Republicans in Congress. If this is true, then in 1866, why did segregation exist in the South until the 1960s? Wouldn't this ban segregation? And the answer to this is Johnson vetoed the bill. But then, actually, the radical Republicans were able to override the bill by Congress, right? But then the Supreme Court later is going to overturn this bill again as well, too. So in order to give this bill real power, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the radical Republicans passed the 14th Amendment. Now, what are two key parts of the 14th Amendment? It's the same as the Civil Rights Amendment Act of 1866, except, right, remember this, the 13th Amendment. It abolishes slavery in the United States. And here's a problem with African Americans. Dred Scott said that slaves were only meant to be in America as property. They had no purpose in America and they could not be citizens of the United States. So now that they're no longer property, are they American? I mean, American citizenship was essentially based on race. Whites were Americans. So what the 14th Amendment does is it says all persons born in the U.S. are citizens. It doesn't. So citizenship in America is no longer based on race. It's based on being born in America or naturalization. And by being a citizen, you are all males are allowed to write the vote. The second thing it says is equal protection and due process, right? The law is applied to and protects all citizens equally, regardless of race, gender, religion, class, or political views. Now, this is the most important amendment in the Constitution. So remember this one. And I want you to make an argument. Think, why is the 14th Amendment the most important amendment in the Constitution? And one simple answer could be obviously the citizenship one, right? It now says anyone born in America is an American citizen, right? Germans are the German people. English are the English people. French are French people. What is an American? Americans, everybody. And this helps the idea of diversity being a part of our country. But the more important one, and this one you need to understand, is equal protection and due process. What does that mean? It basically puts the words in the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution. All men are created equal. Well, the first one there is equal protection, right? And the other one is inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, the purpose of government is to protect those rights. Well, that's due process. Okay. So the government is now has in the Constitution a way to enforce the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the radicals were infuriated at the fact that Confederate officials were elected right back into the office. It was like, wow, wait, you lost the Civil War, but you're right back here in Congress. And you're going to make laws again against black people. So radicals, right, in an effort to try to prevent these Southern Confederate leaders from getting back into office, they passed the Military Reconstruction Act, right? And it's meant to punish the South for the Black Codes and refusing to pass the 14th Amendment. So you can see in the map in the upper right-hand corner, right? The Southern states that rebelled are no longer states. They are now military districts. Okay. And there are 5 military districts, right? So the southern states no longer existed. They no longer have senators. They no longer have representatives, right? And they are being ran by a general. Now, in order for a southern state to re enter the Union, it had to pass the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed that the southern states would protect voting rights for blacks. All right. Now, it was very easy for the states to get back into the Union, and they did very quickly. They said, okay, sure, fine. 14th Amendment, that's ours. Because we'll see. It's one thing to say, yes, we will protect the rights of blacks. It's another thing to actually enforce that. Okay. Which brings us to President Johnson. Now, President Johnson is arguably one of the worst presidents in American history, and he was impeached as president, right? Now, why was he impeached? Why was he brought up on articles of impeachment, right? Well, he was brought up on articles of impeachment, which is the first step of being kicked out of office for firing Secretary of State Edward Stanton. He was the last cabinet member from Lincoln's presidency. Now, remember, Johnson was a Democrat, and he was from the South, and the cabinet is meant to advise the president. Okay. And Edward Stanton was a Republican. Now, why is he there? He was left over from Lincoln's presidency, right? One by one, Johnson been firing Lincoln's guys as he's president. Now, does a president have the right to fire a cabinet member, especially if it's a former president from a different political party? Of course he does, right? All people in the White House or cabinet members serve at the president's leisure. So the president has the right to fire anyone he wants. He's the president, okay? But and what you need to realize, because what he's really being impeached for is he's being impeached for not protecting black rights. Okay, he's allowing the black codes to take place in America, right? So, was that a good reason to impeach the president? Letter I, is racism an impeachable offense? And the answer is no, it's not. It's not illegal to be racist in this country. Okay, it's morally wrong. It can be wrong, but there's other incredibly racist presidents as well too. He's the first one who's being brought up on charges of it. So then, what are the reasons that a president should be impeached from office? Well, people would normally say, in this case, it should be for high crimes and misdemeanors, as it says in the Constitution, right? Treason, corruption, right? Actually breaking a law, okay? And what you need to realize about Johnson is he never committed a crime. He was impeached for completely political reasons, right? He's being impeached because he's a bad president, right? The Republicans don't like his ideas, right? Is that a good reason to impeach a president because one political party doesn't like what the other president's doing? Presidents would be impeached all the time. In fact, letter K, what's the easiest way to actually replace a president if they're bad? The answer is people will say, well, you can impeach the president. Well, you can't because you can't convict the president and kick him out. The easiest way to replace a president is you vote him out in the next election. Each president's only president for 4 years. So just wait a couple years and then vote against the president and he's out of office. Now, several ways that Southerners tried to fight Reconstruction and keep the federal government from protecting black rights. And how did the federal government respond? Well, the KKK is established at this time and is still around today. There in the above, you can see multi-generational images from in the upper left, the beginning of the KKK. In the middle is in the 1920s, the height of the KKK, and on the far right is even today, right? And the thing about the KKK is they are a terrorist organization and they use violence and intimidation to control blacks and terrify white Republicans, right? The government's response was to pass the KKK Act and the Force Act. Now, this is huge. The federal government has the military in the South, and what the federal government does is it suspends habeas corpus in counties with high Klan activity. Now, remember, habeas corpus means that when you get arrested, you have to be charged with a crime. Well, what the government was doing here is they were just rounding people up for being suspected Klan and then throwing them in jail and not giving them a trial, right? And they'd be throwing right. So you're actually arresting the government is arresting Klan members for just being Klan with no trial. Now, is it acceptable to take away rights from a group trying to take away rights from another group? I'll read that one on your own, guys. Okay, so check that one out. But you know what? If one group, if you look at above, does the federal government have a right to take away their rights? Okay. Now, another Civil Rights Act of 1875. It's one of the last acts of Reconstruction. Basically, it said access to public places cannot be denied based on race. Now, the Supreme Court ruled this act unconstitutional. Okay. And then it's going to be Plessy versus Ferguson, which is going to legalize segregation as long as facilities are separate but equal. So here was an attempt in 1875 to try to prevent Jim Crow laws from coming into being. Okay. And the federal government, or not the federal government, but the Supreme Court is going to vote this down and allow this to happen, right? Now, how is the federal government going to fail in its responsibility towards Black people here? And the answer here, guys, is for African Americans to have rights in America, and this is what the problem is going to be. The federal government failed in its responsibility to protect the civil rights of African Americans and left the enforcement of all these laws to southern states who were dominated by racist whites. Okay. Now, the next question is going to be, well, why did the federal government stop all of a sudden? During Reconstruction, the federal government is protecting Black rights. Why did it stop all of a sudden? Well, that's going to be um, the election of 1877. It's a disputed election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Now, you can see on the map in the upper left-hand corner, there are 3 red Republican states in the South, right? South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. And in all 3 states, the Klan and the Democratic Party made attempts to try to prevent African Americans from voting in those 3 states. And when the results came in for the election, there was 2 competing results for all 3 states, and both political parties claimed to have won those 3 states. Okay. And Republicans said that this was a corrupted election because it was a corrupted election. So what you get is a compromise of 1877. And in this, the Republicans say, look, let us just win the presidency. So give us the 3 states. And the Democrats say, okay, you can have the 3 states and you can win the presidency. But what the Democrats get in return is that the Republicans have to pull the army out of the South, right? Which means when the federal government gets out of the South and no one is there to protect Black rights anymore, which then allows racist whites to take control over state governments. Last piece of civil rights activism or amendment is the 15th Amendment. And this amendment was meant to try to protect the voting rights of African Americans. It said that no one can prevent anyone from voting based on race, color, or previous servitude. The 14th Amendment gave Blacks the right to vote, but Southern states were trying to prevent that, right? So this one says you can't keep someone from voting based on race. Now, the problem with this is there's other ways to discriminate without saying it's race. You could do a literacy test. Okay, so voters need to prove that they can read. So you can look at the questions in the upper right there, guys. You can see some of the questions, and that is actually a test that you could pass, but the questions are very confusing, meant for people to fail. And in the later days, it was reading the Constitution or how many jelly beans are in a jar, or how many bubbles in a bar of soap. Okay, they became even more and more false. A poll tax. Voters need to pay a fee to vote, right? So, hey, come on in. You can vote, but it's $20, okay? Problem here is that actually whites were poor in the South too. And they were given, right, a grandfather clause, right? Which meant that any voter whose grandfather voted again before 1860 was exempt from these voting rules. Now, how many Blacks would vote before 1860? None. So basically, those literacy tests and poll tax only applied to Blacks. Now, did the 15th Amendment serve its purpose in allowing Black people to vote? And the answer is no, it didn't. Right? As long as Southern governments are in charge of voting, they can make these rules that targeted Blacks. Okay, so what amendment really gave Blacks the right to vote, and then why could they not vote? And the real amendment that gave Blacks the right to vote, and when you put this together with the 15th Amendment, it was the 14th Amendment, right? That gave Black citizenship, and it should have given them the right to vote. Then why could they not vote? The answer is the federal government was not in the South protecting African American voting rights. And the federal government's not going to get involved and help African American voting rights until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So it's going to be another 90 years. Okay. All right. That's it. Thank you very much, guys. Have a good day.